Hey, you guys, Latricia Morris here, the brand revivalist and owner of Ox and Iron. I am so excited today to welcome Preston Zeller. Preston is the founder of Psalmlog, an AI-powered biblical guidance app helping believers access scripture-based wisdom for real-life challenges. With over 15 years scaling high-growth tech companies, including a cloud guru and Zoom Info, he now pioneers responsible AI integration in ministry, a space where 57% of Christians express skepticism about technology. Preston is also an award-winning documentary filmmaker. His film, The Art of Grieving, chronicles his year of painting 365 works following his brother's sudden death from a fentanyl overdose. The film has reached audiences in over 40 countries. It's been used in educational curriculum and it's available in international libraries. It has also won multiple festival awards. And I'm telling you, the more I get to learn about Preston, the more I realize this man is so accomplished and bringing so much value to the world. So, Preston, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show.
Latricia, thank you so much for the intro and for having me on. And I just appreciate the time we're going to be able to chat together.
Yes, I was so excited that you were willing to break away from all of the amazing things that you're doing to share some of the wisdom that you've gleaned from so many years working with different companies and helping them to scale and really understand growth. With you being behind some very powerhouse tech brands, what would you say are some patterns that you've noticed in among them and what it actually means to move the needle in those companies?
Yeah, well, that's it's a good loaded question in many ways because it's so it covers so many things. I think something people forget about is that there's a general rule of thumb: every time you about double in size, your processes break. And so I saw that happen, of course, multiple times in a variety of different companies where you just assume what got you to a certain growth milestone is going to get you to the next one. And that's really hard. I think it's why you see founding CEOs kind of step aside at some point, especially if they take investment, because they've just kind of maxed out their ceiling of experience and what they feel like they can do in terms of skill and maybe what they're even passionate about. But the other is, really how much the sort of top sets the tone for the rest of the company. And especially if you're say a new CEO, maybe you found yourself growing in a business that was perhaps even circumstantial. I've seen that multiple times where, entrepreneurs are doing multiple things and something just takes off and they find themselves leading a company. And it's like, wow, this is great. And not realizing like you have a huge responsibility now to have clarity and direct and, purpose and direction for everyone. And the degree to which you do that effectively or not really impacts people's desire to come to a company, to stay at a company, to be really to stick with you during hard times. And I think we saw a lot of that during kind of like 22 when the economy shifted, people wanting to stick around at companies, but then also like, well, how are those companies responding to the kind of handbrake that got pulled on the economy? So, I mean, I think there's a lot that does go into that. And ultimately, how do you sort of drive towards very distinct goals, numerical goals that you can measure and say, hey, here's everyone's kind of involvement in that. And knowing that down to the IC level, hey, here's your impact on the company. It's not just like work being done in a vacuum. I think people want to know what kind of impact they're having on the goals that get presented to the company.
Yeah, and I found that too, like when you're talking about people understanding the impact that they're having. You see a lot of companies that just in the day-to-day they get so busy that especially when it comes to frontline workers, it's kind of like, well, we do, branded koozies and a company picnic. And it's like, no,
Right.
people need more than that. Them understanding the meaning behind what it is that they're actually doing is important. Now, one of the things you were talking about is that ability to be adaptable as the business continues to grow. When we're talking about in my my own world, I talk a lot about brand, right? We talk
Mm-hmm.
about how the company needs to have a solid sense of identity, and that while that identity might evolve somewhat over time, just as any human would evolve over their own lifetime, the lifetime of that company, the brand should evolve to some degree, but not necessarily in a way that changes a whole lot. But then that's also looking at the strategy side of it, the marketing side of it, and especially in scaling, what I'm hearing is like, okay, there does need to be a sense of adaptability in the overall plan, and understanding that what got you from, the launch into maybe phase 2 or phase 3 of the business isn't necessarily what's going to sustain that growth. How do you help companies really navigate that balance and staying true to who they are while also adopting the systems and processes that are going to create more opportunities for people within the company?
Yeah, one of those things is understanding where you are in the sort of adoption life cycle of your company. So, there's the whole TAM, SAM, SOM, right? So a lot of people go, "Oh, what's my total addressable market?" Which is like great. That's if everyone in your space conceivably bought your product. But then you drill that down to the sizable, obtainable market, and so, okay, who can we realistically sell to? How much can we realistically get? And then where is that market in terms of like adoption? So the book Crossing the Chasm does a good job of explaining, of course, those different phases. And so what are you still in that kind of early adopter phase? Are you going to mass market? And so from a brand perspective, of course, and I know you work on this quite a bit, I mean, the signals that people need to be able to trust your brand at different stages of adoption are different, and looks different if you're in B2B and B2C. Are you a consumer good? What does that look like? But then, of course, the other thing is as you grow, and startups get a kind of funny rap for this, right? Is like you'll have funky titles that some people just made up, and you'll have sort of maybe legacy mindsets that aren't wanting to sort of adapt to a new process. And I've been there in different roles as well, where it's like it's uncomfortable because you're like, whoa, everything's changing. Everything I thought I knew, the reasons why I like this company is kind of going out the window. It's getting too formal for me. And realizing that like sometimes what does happen is people walk away because it's just not what they want out of, work anymore. And that's okay. It's just part of the growth process of how the companies are going to scale. But also like, as you grow, you're going to need to give people clearer understanding of like, hey, here's how you progress inside this company, and how do you create those growth opportunities. And I think that's a miss that leadership can often have is maybe your hands are tied. I get that. Maybe the company's not growing, or you're trying to restructure it. And we see Oracle, what they just did in terms of laying off 30,000 people, I think it was, which it sucks. And that's terrible. And I think that can happen at smaller companies on a much smaller scale, of course. But the point there being that I think creating a clear expectation and understanding like how do you encourage the sort of fostering of helping people achieve their goals, I guess. And that's not the most eloquent way of putting that, but
Okay.
when you're doing like one-on-ones and check-ins, right? Like what are people actually wanting to accomplish, especially the people that you want to keep around? If you don't know what that is, how are you going to motivate them? And they're probably vocal about it already, saying, hey, I'd like to work on these things, or I'd like to grow here, or maybe shift to a different department. So these are I think aspects of like the growing the skill and developing your employees that gets lost more in small companies. Much larger enterprise companies have very set tracks for this oftentimes, but I think that can be overlooked because you're so focused on, hey, what's the bigger vision of the company, which is great as a CEO, right? But making sure that you have a clear mandate to like actually develop your employees, I think is really important.
Yeah. Well, and looking at, you referenced smaller companies and larger companies, how those larger companies usually have that dialed in. But for all of them, too, there was a point where they had to figure that out. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I've noticed, like many of businesses that I've come across where they almost started accidentally or just as a need or whatever, like somebody came to the market with this incredible idea, and it might have been a new product to meet, solve a new problem. or maybe an old problem, but it could be a product or it could be a service. Maybe they just were so trained up in it. They were offering, I don't know, home services or something like that. And they decided
Mhm.
they were going to step out on their own. So there was that launch phase where they were stepping into the market. They were offering the thing that they do or that they sell. And then things started picking up. But then for a lot of them, it seems like there's this kind of point that they hit that a lot of times they plateau or stagnate. They have a hard
Mhm.
time figuring out their way to get to that next level. And I think a lot of times there is the miss there on seeing what phase they're actually in. Like you
Mhm.
referenced the early adopters versus mass market readiness, right? Like how is it that they understand that they are in one phase or the other? How does their messaging and their strategy need to adapt to that? So what would you say are some misconceptions that people have, or maybe some hurdles that they run into, particularly when they are in that need to when they are in that phase where they need to focus on early adopters? Maybe they don't recognize that, but they're trying to
Mhm.
transition more into mass market.
Well, I'd say first, like, do they have an understanding of the size of their market to begin with? I think a common misstep that companies can take is you diversify into a new, persona, a new ICP, and there's a lot of overhead that comes with that, right? In terms of just the awareness and the education of that space, and maybe there is some like very organic opportunity to do that. The Ansoff matrix is a really interesting way of like plotting that when you're saying, hey, we're going to say work on these new features. What bucket does that fall in? Is it market penetration? Is it market development? I mean, there's different quadrants there, but um, that's a good exercise to help you understand why are you doing certain things, especially now. So I think some of what I've been talking about is like the traditional way of looking at things, but in a forward thinking manner, we're entering into this time period that I think is going to accelerate where companies are fundamentally trying to operate on less employees. And that is, if we're stuck in the past of, hey, companies are going to staff up and maybe have these rigorous advancement tiers for an insane amount of ICs, I seem to I think that's going to kind of fade away a little bit. And that's like Oracle's a good example of that. So I think that in many ways it becomes like what how like what's your area of effectiveness and how kind of multifaceted you can be. I don't think it's going to cut it anymore to really be like in one area. But sorry, I'll dial back to your original question. But yeah, you have to be aware of like what can the market actually um, bear from, and how much of that market can you get. And so, if we think about that adoption curve, $1 million ARR is like that's like the goal for most companies, right? The amount of companies that get to 10 million ARR is like way less. And most people don't realize that too, that it's hard to get to a million, but way harder to get to 10 million, let alone beyond that. So um just having a good understanding of your market at the end of the day, and what you can actually get is good, and what you can again service, as the word implies. Because if you say, oh well, it's a matter of spinning up a whole new experience of our product for this persona, you run the huge risk of like diluting your current audience. I was actually talking with a friend of mine who does creates mobile accessories, and they their revenue was kind of like very similar over certain years, but they had expanded to like 10x the parts. And so, that wasn't necessarily, that was keeping them here, but not making them go up. I think that
Yeah.
the same thing could happen to, any business if they're not understanding why they're growing to begin with.
Well, I think sometimes people come in and it's like there isn't as much thought as maybe We understand that there should be when it comes to what you're trying to scale to, why you're trying to scale to it, what kind of company are you actually trying to build, right? Because
Yeah.
there's this idea that like, well, once you start a business, what is the goal of the business? To be successful. Well, what is being successful? Making more money and serving more clients and serving more customers. And it's like, I think sometimes we got to take that step back. One of the things you mentioned a while ago was how many people you can service in the market or how much of the market you can take on, right? I think too, there's something to be said about having a solid strategy, understanding where you are and how you gain access into maybe a different sector of the market or a larger sector of the market that you may not necessarily have within the first year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years of business, but that you grow into. Like for some companies, there's a little bit more of an evolution there than others, right? Like some of them is like, this is what we sell shoelaces and that's the only thing, it's like,
Sure.
we're going to go from white and black shoelaces to multicolored shoelaces. Like this is our progression. It could be something, I know that's probably a dumb example, but like, I know, for myself with my company, like I originally launched my company with graphic design. It's what I knew at the time that I started my agency. I had no clue how to do the business of a graphic design agency. I just knew how to, make the stuff look dang freaking good. But it was like at the same time, I felt like having some humility in understanding what season I was in of growth has been a huge help in saying, okay, who is my target market right now? People that are looking for XYZ that, more fit this kind of profile. And sometimes that allows you to stack experience, credentials, connections, other things like that, while also getting a lot more market data that you can use as you look to elevate your positioning, elevate your messaging, and move your company into its next phase without all the chaos of just trying to be bigger for the sake of being bigger, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I remember years ago when I had my own agency and I was working with HubSpot, so I was like trying to be a HubSpot partner agency. And you see agencies sometimes or still that are like, oh, full service, all industries. And they had this example that it was somewhere back in like Midwest, but they specifically worked as an agency for, mechanic shops or something, in that area. It was very niche down. And that's, I think that's just goes back to finding a niche, speaking to a specific need of an audience. And so, I think when you're trying to grow out of, say, just a niche that you started with, it's easy to start going, okay, well, man, we could apply us to so many different use cases. Cars are actually a decent example, right? Because if you want to go buy an SUV, you could buy all sorts of SUVs, right? But there's a very big difference in someone who buys like a really tricked out Escalade and someone who buys like a used Tahoe or something. So very similar cars, right? But their needs are going to be a bit different. So I think, defining who you're selling to is super important, of course. And again, businesses could be like, especially if it comes easy in the beginning, because it is something that was just like very organic. Maybe it was from an existing business and you developed a new product for that, growing that into something else, just being very clear and sort of, rigorous about how you're choosing to expand.
I think right now, like one of the challenges that has come with the time that we are in is there being so much noise. And so like before AI was launched, we were already told you need to be posting 3 to 5 times a day, right? Like all of this stuff, right? So everybody's like, it's just so much. It's just all this noise. And then all these things that we think we're supposed to be doing. And then it's like, welcome AI. Now you have the ability to create these avatars and have AI help you pump out 5 to 10 posts a day. And there's just this flood of stuff. And I feel like a lot of the market is becoming overwhelmed. Meanwhile, a lot of companies are feeling this compulsion to integrate all these different things because, well, we got to, this is trending and that's trending. There is a massive trend towards trend chasing as opposed to stopping long enough to think about what you're doing to take up a stronger position and actually lead in the market instead of chasing the market. So one of the things you talk about is strategy over noise. And how do you help companies put that into practice so that they can discern between something that might be another opportunity, but probably not for them, and things that really could be stellar for helping them to get an added point of traction to grow their business?
Yeah, so an exercise I went through in the past with the prior CEO I worked with is we actually, um, in I think it was like a 2 hour workshop, but we specifically went through like, hey, because you have to bring out the vision of the CEO ultimately, right? Because they're gonna set the tone for whatever the company works on. So if you dig into all the different like aspects of the business, hey, here are the things we do. Um, why do those have opportunity? Why do they not? This isn't how this is vaguely how that exercise runs. Where are you operationally inefficient too, right? I mean, you could find that there's some aspect of how you're actually making decisions or how you are choosing to execute on go-to-market campaigns that makes you that A, lacks clarity, or B, makes you work on the wrong things. So those kinds of exercises to help bring again a better sense of like what is actually working, what do we want to double down on, what do we want to stop doing. Very it sounds very simple what I'm explaining, but as you just said, there's a tendency for people to just continue to pile on more, especially as there's employee attrition too. That's kind of the ironic thing that you see happening where hey, there's redundancy or attrition because people are just tired of whatever is going on, and then you're throwing tools at people to fill those roles, which is such a tall order. It's a wild thing, but I think ultimately like CEOs need to have the maturity at least to step back from the business and be willing to look at it objectively to say like, what are we just doing because we've been doing it? Where can we have our foundation be a lot more secure versus just piling on more initiatives to potentially broken process already, which is not going to fix any problems, right?
So, what would you say as far as like the people that are considering, like, okay, should we pile on more things or should we try new things? I think a readiness to try new things is important. It's also important to understand that it's not always the best idea to go chasing every new thing that comes about. So,
Yeah.
how do you help people discern whether they should maybe open themselves up to exploring a little bit more, giving themselves the room to experiment to see if a thing might work without becoming so fragmented and diluted by trying to stretch themselves way too thin, doing all the different things?
Yeah, I mean, something I've heard happening more is, and I've found myself often in this kind of role, is you have to have a person who's dedicated to kind of like they have a specific, I don't know, mission basically to experiment and to look for those opportunities within the company. It has to be a dedicated time. I mean, yes, you could bring in a consultant to do that, and whether it's that or it's somebody who's full time in the company, there has to be concerted effort there. That's the word I was looking for. If there's not, it's not going to happen. And it could be the CEO too, but I think you need someone outside the CEO as well, because the CEO is not going to be probably have enough headspace to do that. And certainly the bigger the company is, but also what's working. Does anyone know that? Again, like there are these things that, my last company, we were doing really rigorous OKRs, and I led the, that process for, I don't know, a year and a half or something like that. And at some point we needed to ask ourselves, is this OKR process really even like beneficial, or could we make some version of it? There's lots of ways to measure goals, MBOs, and all that kind of stuff. But the point being, we were stuck in doing this kind of legacy goal setting process because it felt mature, but was it helping? And actually there's a really interesting article that we read that Google stopped doing it because they're like, it's overkill. And it was overkill for Google. And, so, and then the joke was there too, the OKRs were created to slow everyone else down. And that's a concept where it's like, all these books have been read on, written on it, like Measure What Matters and stuff like that. But you got to ask not what is everyone else doing, but what works for us and
Mhm.
what is working for us. And again, that like, what should we be doing more of? I forget what book it is, but it talks about bright spots and how you have to have some kind of habit of being able to identify the stuff that is really impactful and do more of that, and then find the stuff that isn't, change it. And along with that, you have some role as an innovator within a company who is actively looking for those different opportunities and has the leeway to experiment or at least to propose those types of things.
When I got to talk to you before and you were sharing just different things from your experience and just even the conversation around business and stuff like that, I'm like, this guy has so much of a wealth of wisdom to offer. And so I thought it was so cool when you shared that you do take on, I understand, limited coaching clients where you help them in their
Yeah.
businesses and things like that. One of the things that I think is so great about that is that you can have people that are in a company that are truly top tier. They are among the best of the best, but can still struggle to see the blind spots versus maybe the bright spots, as you were talking about, just by being in it all the
Mhm.
time. And like, there's so much value to having somebody who understands the business, understands what it is that you're trying to accomplish, and can help you to, see it from that more aerial view, and, or even just, down in the details, but to see it from a different perspective of somebody who's not necessarily entrenched it day to day in it day to day, or somebody that doesn't necessarily have so much of the decision making burdens weighing on their shoulders, because that can tax our judgment as well, as far as like what's going to be the best move, which direction should we go, and all of that.
Well, yeah, and within any company, right? There's politics everywhere. I love it when I'm not love it, but I think it's ironic when companies go, "We're not very political." I was like, "Yes, you are." Just what flavor of political are you? But right. But it is difficult. And this is why I've been on both sides of this, where I've been on the consultant side and I've been on the internal side, where you're like, why did they hire these consultants just to tell them what we already told them? And you're internal. And it's sometimes just because they want that comfort of another opinion, an outside opinion who has, no preconceived bias, and there's assumptions there too, but no preconceived bias as to what we should do. And so yeah, that I think that's, if you're listening to this and you're like, man, I don't have anyone who I can rely on to give us that objective input, or you kind of all lost the bigger picture because you're too in the details, getting someone to help you with that can be a huge advantage, and that's the reason why consultants can be expensive, right? It's because you're
Mhm.
hiring someone who's been through that stuff before, but they're going to ideally help you pull out of the fogginess of being unsure what to do and give you a plan to actually go execute on, or at least the foundation for one. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that when you say like consultants can be expensive, it's like they're an investment,
Right.
but they're generally speaking never near as costly as the confusion is in operation, right? Like when you have a lack of clarity and you're trying to make all these decisions in that fog, in that haze, that in itself can be very expensive. And we can look around and see examples of companies that have not wanted to make that investment into having that expert help come in, and paid for it, sometimes even to the death of the business, because
Mm-hmm.
they weren't willing to pause and say, you know what, we really do need to get an outside opinion, even if it's just to make sure that we're heading on the right track, because it's going to
Mm-hmm.
cost us a lot less to invest in that person to come in for a season than it is for us to take this ship in an absolute wrong direction, pull up to the wrong port, and figure everything else out in hindsight. Like we don't want to do that, right? So there's much wisdom in that. Well, another thing that I loved hearing was that here you have all this experience with tech, and you have all of this experience with business, and somehow you said, you know what, let me make room in life to apply that, merging together that experience along with your passion for ministry, and here you have Psalmlog. Can you tell our listeners a little bit more about your app and maybe your inspiration for starting it?
Yeah. So Psalmlog is a 24/7 personalized biblical life coach. And, I really started out of this desire to um, help people understand more, like get more insight from prayer journals or like reflective journaling. Because it's a problem I'm well familiar with. I don't want to tackle like broad scope journaling. It was too like, um, yeah, it's just covered like every possible sort of belief system that I wouldn't be able to understand well. But I do understand the biblical approach. And so everyone I know who keeps journals, doesn't matter who, what belief system, they end up with a stack of journals, right? And what you're left with though is an extensive personal inventory that you aren't getting really insight from. And so most people don't go back and read that stuff. So I started as like, hey, come and journal, but then I realized to the marketing messaging standpoint, right? Like no one's sitting around going, man, I need to journal more. They're sitting around being like, I have a problem and I need it fixed. And after I did more research, in particularly one particular study I did, um, it revealed that people want answers from the Bible and they know it has answers. They don't know where to look. And they oftentimes may read something, but don't know how it applies to their life. And so because I've been so entrenched in all this, technology work and whatnot over the years, I saw a perfect sort of marrying there of my background to say, this isn't a replacement for anything. It's a tool for people to be able to approach scripture in a way to understand scripture better and get them into that, but then also understand themselves better. So when you're up in the middle of the night and you can't sleep and you can't call a friend because they're not awake, or you don't want to share something with somebody, you can go in there and share whatever it is with the journal templates, and you'll get back basically like a personalized devotional in a similar way, like a biblical counselor might do. I think the goal there is to just make scripture more approachable for people and hopefully bring them out of that bad situation. Whether it's like you do one entry, you get relief in that moment, great. Or there's people who go, man, I can start to get continual insight out of that. And I see people doing it every day in there. So yeah.
Well, I think having the ability to, have some record to look back on of your journey with God is important. Now, like when we were doing the bio, one of the things that we noted is that there are 57% of Christians are more apprehensive when it comes to the integration of technology, especially AI. And I think part of that is like, for one, there is like, we don't like, we understand that the point and the purpose of it is not to replace our walk with God, but more to support our walk with God, right?
Yeah.
But I think sometimes people approach it with a sense of preconceived notions that come from their experience with like, I don't know, Google's AI model that is, given mixed signals as like some of that's biblical, but some of that really isn't.
Sure.
So how do you approach that with the app that you have in place for people and help them to take comfort in knowing that it's set up to really be a tool to help them on their journey?
Yeah. So, I mean, for one, people can try it for free without ever logging in to be like validate that, oh, this is actually giving me something helpful. And every single scripture reference you can tap on right in your entry and, validate right there that this is, this is contextually accurate. Right. But the other thing is, and this is kind of speaking to a tangential part of what you're asking, but like, I think part of the skepticism are denominational differences in certain things.
Fair.
And that's like there's a lot of those shades. It's not, and I speak to this on the site where it's like it's not designed to address your sort of dogmatic view about something. It's just like, what does scripture clearly say about it? And then where it's not, it's falling back on sort of free will and also like to seek Jesus in the process of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, and overall though, Latricia, it's like people have to try it and sort of see for themselves. Part of what's interesting about Psalmlog is it's a new thing. It's a new thing beyond just like a lot of people have layered, you know, some amount of like a Christian worldview on top of like a chat experience. I didn't want to do that because I think there's sort of downsides to just open-ended chat, right? Versus a more journaling approach where it's like, I'm going to just write out what's on my heart and then get feedback on that in a session that's not endless. Because if you go, let's say, talk with someone for an hour, it's an hour. You know, you're not
Yeah.
you're not ruminating for 16 hours with that person. So yeah, I think ultimately people have to try it and decide, hey, is this worth it or not for me? But I continually test and iterate to make sure that it's coming back with the right kind of information.
Very cool. So one of the things I wanted to pivot the conversation to as
Yeah.
well, to hit on just while I have you here, because I
Yeah.
would hate not get a chance to ask you a little bit more about it, is your documentary.
Mm.
Going through what you went through had to have been very hard, to say the
Mm.
least. And I know a lot of people that they have to walk through the process of grieving, and they often just kind of like, I don't want to say stuff it, but it's not something that, like part of their grieving process is they allow themselves, maybe they might allow themselves to go through the mourning
Stuffing
and the
it is
grieving
actually a fair
themselves.
word, because that does seem like what a lot of people do.
Yeah. But then, to see somebody take their own experience as you have, bring that out into something that is publicly available, internationally available, to share that with people. What is it that inspired you, and even prompted or encouraged you to open up about your own experience there in a way of helping other people through theirs?
Yeah, it's interesting, and I know you're an artist too, so it's like there's some amount of being an artist where I think you have your own insecurities about your own work, but you also have to have this fearlessness of like, this work is true to me, and if you don't like it, oh well. Because your artwork's not going to speak to everyone, and so I've had that like sort of conditioning my whole life to some degree, or my life up to now, where it's I knew that by going through this process myself and having this filmmaking background, I was like, man, I would like to see this if somebody made it. So I'm going to be a bit more public about it, because I really found that, and there's one distinct art show, Latricia, where I put up a bunch of big paintings, and I talk about this in the documentary a bit, where I had an art show and had these abstract paintings up, and I'm telling my grief story to people after they've had a chance to look at the paintings, and there was just something that clicked there, where people were able to interpret the abstract art from themselves, and they kind of ascribed their own meaning. But once they found out the symbolism in it and why I painted it, they would cry. They would share their own grief stories. People I thought I knew well. They would start sharing about someone they had lost, and so it struck me that the visual medium could be really impactful in that way. But that's oddly enough, in connection with like Psalmlog and stuff, I had a journal at that time that I wrote, paint every day for a year, make a documentary about it. It was 2 simple lines. And just putting that out there alone made me, it set in course this whole thing. I mean, was like almost 7 years ago now, which is crazy to
Wow.
think. Yeah.
That's a major commitment though, because it's, we all have the life stuff that's going on and other things that are going on around us. And then sometimes too, we have an idea, and then then taking it from idea to implementation for a full year of doing it daily. That is a lot of commitment, but I love how you held fast to that and allowed God to use it as a place for conversation. Like one of the things that I got to see myself over the years, especially starting years on years back, was the power of being willing to share your story, and not
Mm-hmm.
for the sake of like trauma dumping. I think there's kind of
Yeah.
like this, that we're in a time of people kind of mashing that up, and it's like, it's not me giving the sob story about all the stuff that was done to me and all the da 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 da, but sharing just enough of your own story to give people permission to share theirs in a way that
Mm.
allows them to step into a place of healing. So you don't need all my details. You don't need all of that stuff. God's big enough. He knows it. He's got it. Right.
Hmm.
But at the same time, I think there's that, like, there's the one extreme of hide all the things that you feel bad about or feel shamed about or all of any of that. Like, nobody wants to hear it, or what are they going to think of me, or whatever. And really, at the end of the day, it's not about me. It's about his glory story being told.
Mm.
And so I love when he takes whatever it is that we've gone through and allows us to bring it into a space where people who have been carrying that weight of trying to hold on to something, that he's saying, just let it go. Like, just
Mm.
put it here at my feet. Like, them being able to feel safe enough to step into a space of healing.
Yeah.
That is remarkable. And I think that is a beautiful byproduct of us just saying, you know what, God, like, whatever gifts I have, they're yours. Use them
Mm.
however you want. Use them to tell your story in someone else's life, because it's not mine, it's yours.
Wow, that was beautifully put. And I think there are a couple interesting aspects of this documentary. Like, one is I fully agree, the kind of victimhood mentality, right? That's where you're just like living in your trauma and revisiting it, and everyone's got to be there to make you feel better about yourself all the time. Like, I wanted people to walk away from this documentary feeling good, which is weird for a story about death and loss and grief, and because that flips it on its head. And I also knew, like, people wouldn't be like, hey, go watch this film, it's really depressing. Like that. I
Yeah.
didn't think that had a lot of share factor in it, but really, that's a lot of just my mentality, is growth mentality. And it does do that. I mean, it's wild, people who come out of it and go, I never thought about art, I'm gonna go paint, or I'm gonna, I have some things I need to resolve. But one of the cool things is there's this history section, right? And so the history section is like, well, how has art been used through history to depict grief? Or how has it, artists changed subject matter after experiencing grief? But in the process of like doing the research for that section of the film, I'm looking at like grief artwork and all this kind of stuff, and realizing what's the most covered, painted about death in history. It's Jesus. And so it really kind of, in an apropos way, just pointed back to Jesus right in the middle of the film, because that's historically accurate in terms of what people have painted about. Which it also speaks to the point of, like, the film's not like overtly, taking a spiritual stance, but I fully agree. I mean, like, being able to give it to Jesus, and that is what I've had to do ultimately. And that transformation for me has been amazing.
I love that. So, what do you have coming up next in the world of Preston that you're excited to bring out into the world?
Yeah, so I mean, Psalmlog, I'm so heads down on that right now, and I will continue to be for, I think, a long time. But aside from that, we were just talking about the film website right before this. I relaunched the film website, so that's been out for almost 4 years now, streaming online, all that kind of stuff. But what's interesting, when you watch the film, it'll feel finished, and it is in a way. But to me, it never has been truly finished, because the original goal of that was to have a public exhibition, and be able to actually, like, have cut in interviews of people who are looking at this thing physically, and feel the presence of it in that way. Well, that wasn't able to happen because I did it right around like 2020, right? 2021. And I had moved to Texas freshly, and it was like I didn't really know anyone. So there's a good chance later this summer it will actually be in a public exhibition for first responders in the Bay Area in California, and that we will actually film the last like 20-30 minutes of that film, and it'll be edited in and re-released as a longer feature-length documentary. So where it ends now, it'll cut and say like 5 years later or whatever. So that's
Cool.
that's the other kind of big thing going on right now. Yeah.
That's cool, because a lot of people with a project like that, it's like, okay, it's done, it's behind us, we're moving on to the next thing. And you're saying, you know what? No, the story isn't done being told. there's still more work to be done, and we're keeping that part of the book open and like keeping it moving forward. That's very cool.
What's interesting about that, and like for anyone who's listening to this and you have some project where maybe you did think it was behind you, I think the fascinating thing about projects that resonate with people, and that documentary has more than I even figured it would in some ways. It's come back up so often that it's like God's been reminding me, like, hey, you're not done with this. It's probably more that than it is me in many ways, like you were saying with your different art pieces. And so, like, don't ignore those promptings. I think, you may think, I was a one and done, whatever, but maybe there's something more there. That's okay to keep going after.
For people who want to continue tracking along your journey, maybe get updated to see when that re-release is out, or even just want to tap into like coaching and viewing your art, or all of these, I feel like we covered so much, right?
Yeah.
Can you tell people where you would say is the best place to start? And you guys know that I will put the links in the captions below, but where would you say is a good place to start for people that are stepping into your world?
Yeah, I mean, go to the Art of Grieving film.com. Great place for the documentary, or just go to prestonzeller.com. And that's more like the sort of business growth side of things. And then find me on LinkedIn. That's where I'm most active from a social platform.
Very cool. Well, Preston, thank you so much for popping on the show and for all that you shared, the wealth of wisdom as well as the depth of your story. It's a beautiful thing. And I'm truly grateful that you took the time to be on here today. So for the rest of you guys, again, I will put the links in the caption for you to be able to check in with Preston, follow along on the journey, maybe even come alongside him. And especially if you have a business and you're looking for some outside support and help in that mission to take your business to the next level, make sure you connect with him. And also, before you go, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you see more on building a brand and a business that you love. All right. Thank you so much, Preston. You guys take care.